The mine didn't detonate. That was the problem. The Russian column commander, riding in a BTR-82A somewhere in the middle of his formation, had been told the lane was clear. His sappers had swept it twice. The thermal imagery from his UAV showed open ground, a dirt track running southeast toward the outskirts of Pokrovsk, and no Ukrainian positions within direct fire range. Everything looked correct. Everything was wrong. The lane was clear because Ukrainian engineers had made it clear, deliberately, precisely, with the kind of cold, tactical patience that turns a minefield from a barrier into a trap. And at the far end of that lane, pre-registered fire coordinates had been waiting for weeks. FPV operators had memorized the approach. Anti-tank teams had their arcs of fire mapped to the meter. The moment that BTR-82A crossed the invisible threshold, it wasn't entering a gap in Ukrainian defenses. It was entering the kill. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct exactly how Ukraine's 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade turned the mined terrain southeast of Pokrovsk into one of the most methodically brutal channelized killzone operations of the entire Donetsk campaign. We will walk through the engineering, the intelligence, the doctrine, and the footage, frame by geolocated frame, that shows how a defending brigade held an entire armored axis at a cost Russia could not afford to pay. The central question of this episode is not whether Ukraine could hold the Pokrovsk approaches. The question is how they forced Russia to attack exactly where Ukrainian weapons were already pointing. Pokrovsk sits at the intersection of two realities that define the entire Eastern Front. As a city, it holds roughly 60,000 civilian residents and is the administrative center of Pokrovsk Rayon. As a military node, it is something far more significant. A rail junction whose capture would functionally sever Ukrainian logistics across a wide arc of Donetsk Oblast. The M30 highway runs through it. The rail lines branching from it supply Ukrainian brigades across a front stretching from Avdiivka's wreckage northward toward Toretsk. Losing Pokrovsk would not simply cost Ukraine a city. It would force a logistical reorganization under fire across one of the most contested sectors of the entire war. Russian forces had been pressing toward Pokrovsk since the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024. With that fortress city finally in Russian hands after months of grinding urban combat, the axis of advance shifted westward. Units from the 5th Combined Arms Army, the 41st Combined Arms Army, and elements of the Chechen Akhmat structures rotated through the assault formations targeting the villages and farm tracts southeast of Pokrovsk. The terrain here is characteristic of the Donetsk steppe. Shallow rolling hills, agricultural fields stripped bare by years of war, occasional tree lines along drainage gullies, and a road network that funnels any armored movement onto predictable routes. There is very little cover and almost no concealment at any useful scale. Tanks are visible from kilometers away. The ground, in short, is a defender's canvas. Holding the southeastern approaches fell in large part to the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade, a formation that had been reconstituted and re-equipped following heavy fighting earlier in the war, and had developed considerable operational experience with combined arms defensive tactics. The brigade operated in coordination with other Ukrainian formations across the wider Pokrovsk sector, but bore significant responsibility for the mined belt running along the terrain corridors that Russian armored units were using to probe toward the city's outskirts. The 47th's challenge was a classic asymmetry of the modern battlefield. Russia had numerical depth. Ukraine had precision and preparation. Russia could absorb equipment losses in a way that would be catastrophic for any NATO force. Ukraine could not trade ground indefinitely. The solution the brigade developed, and which OSINT analysts began reconstructing from geolocated wreckage footage in the autumn and winter of 2024, was not simply mining the approaches. It was engineering the battlefield so that Russian commanders would make the choices Ukraine needed them to make. I spent significant time working through the geolocated footage and terrain analysis that forms the basis of this reconstruction, and one detail kept returning to me as I built the picture: the deliberateness of it. This was not reactive defense. It was offensive engineering, applied defensively. Ukraine was not reacting to Russian probes. Ukraine was constructing the conditions under which Russian probes would fail, repeatedly, in the same way, in the same places, until the cost became untenable. Here is what that actually means in practice. Ukrainian military engineers, working with the 47th's planning staff, constructed a minefield belt across the southeastern approaches to Pokrovsk that was notable not for its density, but for its architecture. The fields were not laid as uniform barriers designed to stop all movement. They were designed with deliberate structure: dense obstacle zones on the flanks, mined areas across the obvious bypass routes, and maintained corridors, lanes where mines were absent or cleared, running through the center of the most tactically tempting approach routes. The purpose of the lanes was not to offer Russian forces a path through. The purpose was to tell Russian forces where to go. Russian armored doctrine, when facing minefields, follows a logic that any competent military would recognize. Commanders seek lanes, either by detecting gaps with engineering assets or by following what appears to be pre-existing vehicle tracks, suggesting previous movement. They concentrate their column in the lane to minimize exposure time in the minefield. They move quickly. Every one of these doctrinal responses, entirely rational from the perspective of the Russian column commander, delivered his vehicles precisely into the cone of fire that Ukrainian anti-tank teams, FPV drone operators, and pre-registered artillery had established at the lane's exit. The kill zones were not improvised. Satellite imagery analyzed by open-source researchers in the autumn of 2024 and cross-referenced against geolocated wreckage showed consistent patterns. Disabled Russian vehicles clustered at specific terrain features, at specific distances from the minefield's apparent edge, in positions consistent with vehicles that had successfully navigated the mine belt only to be struck immediately upon emerging. The density of wreckage at certain points was remarkable. In one sector analyzed by Oryx-affiliated researchers, more than a dozen armored vehicles were confirmed destroyed within a roughly 400-meter radius, a pattern that is the signature of a prepared kill zone rather than a running engagement. Now, here is where this gets genuinely interesting. Stick with us through the next section, because what Ukraine did to reseal the lanes after Russian forces identified them is a piece of real-time battlefield engineering that changes how you understand remote mining systems entirely. Ukrainian intelligence tracking of Russian assault preparations southeast of Pokrovsk drew on multiple collection streams that are partially reconstructible from open sources. Intercepted communications, fragments of which circulated in Ukrainian military channels in heavily redacted form, indicated that Russian assault units were conducting systematic reconnaissance of the approach routes, identifying what they believed were navigable lanes through the Ukrainian minefield belt. Forward observers in concealed positions reported on Russian engineering asset movements, specifically the activity of combat engineer units attempting to sweep approaches before armored columns followed. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, cross-referenced against Ukrainian General Staff reporting, showed the assembly of Russian armor in staging areas roughly 6 to 12 kilometers southeast of the contact line. The concentrations were consistent with battalion-level task groups preparing for deliberate assault rather than opportunistic probing. The Ukrainians could see the preparation happening. The question was not whether Russian forces were coming. The question was exactly when and through which routes their columns would attempt to move. What Ukrainian intelligence correctly assessed, according to multiple open-source reconstructions of the battle pattern, was that Russian commanders had identified at least 2 of the deliberate lanes in the minefield belt. Russian reconnaissance drones had overflown the area sufficiently to allow engineers to plot what appeared to be clear routes. From the Russian side, this looked like useful intelligence. They had found the gaps. They had a plan. From the Ukrainian side, this was confirmation that the shaping had worked. The Ukrainian response to confirmation of Russian assault preparations involved tightening the pre-registration of fire assets across the kill zone approaches. Artillery units supporting the 47th had coordinates pre-plotted for the terrain features at the exits of each deliberate lane. Multiple launch rocket systems held fire missions queued. Anti-tank teams were positioned in concealed fighting positions with overlapping fields of fire on the lane exits. FPV drone cells, operating in the small, nimble formations that had become standard across the Ukrainian front by late 2024, were pre-staged with flight routes programmed for the most likely target areas. Put yourself in the position of the Ukrainian brigade commander for a moment. You have watched Russian forces probe your lines repeatedly. You have seen the pattern of their reconnaissance. You know with reasonable confidence that they believe they have found your weak points. And you know those weak points are the positions you chose. The entire operational picture looks, from the Russian side, like an opportunity. From your side, it is a closing trap. The assault came in multiple waves over a period that open-source researchers have reconstructed as spanning several days in the autumn of 2024, with the most concentrated fighting occurring as Russian forces committed larger armored elements following initial infantry probing. The first Russian vehicles to move into the deliberate lanes were typically engineering assets and infantry carriers rather than tanks. The standard Russian practice of leading with vehicle types that could identify remaining obstacles before more valuable armor followed. The opening moves of the engagement demonstrated exactly the pattern Ukrainian planning had anticipated. Russian vehicles entered the lane. They moved with reasonable speed, consistent with a formation that believed it had cleared ground ahead. They reached the lane exit, and there, the prepared fires opened. The first confirmed FPV strikes in the reconstructed footage sequence show vehicles halting after initial hits, a critical moment, because a halted vehicle in a narrow lane immediately creates an obstacle for vehicles behind it. This is the first multiplier of the channelized kill zone. A single immobilized vehicle transforms the lane into a trap for the entire column. Vehicles behind cannot advance past the wreckage. Reversing under fire is difficult and slow. The column bunches. The kill zone expands to consume the bunched formation. Artillery pre-registered on the lane exits began working through the concentrated armor. Ukrainian General Staff reporting from this period referenced significant Russian armored losses in the Pokrovsk direction without specifying exact engagements, which is consistent with the documented pattern of Ukrainian operational security around active defensive operations. But the wreckage footage that emerged in the weeks following told the story with sufficient clarity for open-source analysts to reconstruct the engagement geometry. The tank losses visible in geolocated footage from the southeastern Pokrovsk approaches included T-72B3 variants, the most common Russian main battle tank in the Donetsk theater, as well as T-80 BVM models and multiple BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles. The wreckage patterns were consistent with top attack and side aspect hits, indicating a combination of FPV drones approaching from overhead angles and anti-tank guided missile engagements from prepared firing positions on the flanks of the lane exits. Several vehicles showed evidence of ammunition cook-off. The catastrophic internal explosion that occurs when a penetrating warhead reaches the autoloader carousel or stowed ammunition, which is visible in footage as the distinctive turret displacement that has become grimly familiar in this war. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many FPV drone strikes does it take to stop a Russian battalion-level assault? Think about that while we continue, because the answer, when we get to the loss assessment, is both smaller and larger than most people expect. What Russian forces did next was tactically logical and operationally predictable. Having suffered losses at the lane exits, assault commanders attempted to identify alternate routes to find other apparent gaps in the minefield belt. This is where Ukraine's use of remote mining systems enters the picture, and it is the piece of the 47th Doctrine that most significantly distinguishes this operation from standard minefield defense. The Ukrainian military had been deploying remote mine-laying systems, including artillery-delivered rams mines and helicopter or drone-delivered scatterable mining munitions, since early in the full-scale war. By the autumn of 2024, the integration of remote mining into the active defensive scheme southeast of Pokrovsk had reached a level of operational sophistication that allowed Ukrainian forces to reseal lanes that Russian forces had identified or partially cleared. When Russian engineering assets swept a lane and a Russian column commander reported it clear to his superiors, Ukrainian remote mining systems could lay new fields in that lane faster than Russian forces could adapt their route plan. This created a dynamic that multiple open-source analysts described as a ratchet. Once Russian forces committed to an approach route, Ukrainian forces could progressively constrain their options. Clear one lane, and the next probe finds it mined again. Attempt to move around the flanks, and the flanking routes have been addressed. The deliberate lanes remained as the only apparently viable paths, the only paths Ukrainian forces had chosen not to reseal because those lanes led to the kill zones. The obstacle encounter at roughly the 7-minute mark of any individual Russian assault attempt became, in reconstructed footage and reporting, something close to a doom loop. Column enters lane, column reaches exit, fire opens. Lead vehicles are struck, column stalls. Trailing vehicles attempt to back out. Remote mining has resealed the rear approach. The column is trapped in the lane with fires from the front and mines closing off retreat. This is channelized Killzone Doctrine at its most refined. What strikes us, analyzing this pattern across the reconstructed sequence of engagements, is that the 47th's approach is doctrinally distinct from either pure minefield defense or mobile anti-armor ambush. It is a synthesis that uses engineering to remove the defender's requirement for mass. The brigade did not need overwhelming numbers to hold this ground. It needed precise preparation, disciplined fire control, and the engineering capacity to maintain the trap's integrity across multiple Russian assault cycles. The most striking detail in the OSINT reconstruction, the one that stayed with me through hours of reviewing footage and terrain analysis, is the consistency of the wreckage locations. Vehicle after vehicle, across engagements separated by days and in some cases weeks, appears disabled at essentially the same terrain features. The kill zone coordinates were not adjusted because they did not need to be. Russian commanders kept sending columns into the same lanes, reaching the same exits, meeting the same fires. The trap worked identically on the second assault as it had on the first. The honest assessment, which Ukrainian officers would likely not offer publicly, and Russian sources are obviously not going to volunteer, is that Russian tactical decision-making in this sector showed a persistent failure to adapt. After the first catastrophic loss event at a lane exit, a prudent commander would question whether the lane was actually a deliberate trap. Russian forces in this sector largely did not reach that conclusion quickly enough to alter their approach before accumulating the losses that forced a pause. Here is our take, and we recognize this will generate some pushback. The 47th's success in this sector was not primarily a function of superior equipment. Ukraine was not fielding weapons Russia lacked. Both sides have FPV drones. Both sides have artillery. Both sides can lay mines. The decisive advantage was intellectual, a brigade-level application of shaping doctrine that Russian tactical commanders did not identify, adapt to, or defeat. That is a more uncomfortable conclusion for Russian military planners than any equipment gap, because equipment gaps can be addressed with production and procurement. Doctrine gaps require a fundamentally different kind of institutional change. If you are following this war seriously, not just the daily headlines but the actual operational patterns, this episode matters because it shows something that the casualty figures alone cannot communicate.
From the moment they start,
What the wreckage footage from the Pokrovsk approaches tells us, read correctly, is that Russian numerical advantage in this sector was being actively neutralized by Ukrainian conceptual superiority. That is a different kind of military balance than the one most analysts describe. Russian losses in the southeastern Pokrovsk sector, as reconstructed from Oryx data, Ukrainian General Staff reporting, and geolocated footage analysis, accumulated over the autumn and winter of 2024 into figures that represent genuine strategic attrition. Oryx's verified equipment loss database, which applies a strict standard of photographic confirmation before counting any destroyed or captured asset, documented dozens of armored vehicles confirmed destroyed in the wider Pokrovsk direction during this period, with the southeastern approaches accounting for a disproportionate share of the tank and IFV losses relative to the frontage involved. The financial dimension of these losses is worth stating explicitly. A T-72B3 tank, at Russian export and production pricing, costs approximately $3 to $4 million. A T-80BVM, with its more capable gas turbine engine and composite armor package, runs higher. Estimates range from $5 to $6 million per unit depending on the configuration. BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles add another $1 to $2 million per hull. A single battalion-level task group assault that loses 8 to 12 armored vehicles in a single engagement, a figure consistent with the wreckage patterns visible in geolocated footage from this sector, represents between $30 and $60 million in destroyed equipment at Russian book value, absorbed in a matter of hours across a frontage of a few kilometers. Against that figure, place the cost of the Ukrainian systems that achieved these results. An FPV drone armed with an adapted RPG warhead costs between $400 and $800 to produce and field. An artillery shell costs a fraction of the vehicle it destroys. The rams and scatterable mines used to reseal lanes are expensive by munition standards, but represent a small fraction of the armored vehicle losses they impose. The cost-exchange ratio in this sector was grotesque from the Russian perspective, and this is precisely what mobility denial doctrine, correctly applied, is designed to achieve. Intercepted Russian communications that circulated in Ukrainian military channels and were partially reported by open-source monitoring groups showed a pattern of blame shifting and confusion that became familiar across this sector. Unit commanders reported lane routes as cleared that were subsequently found mined again, generating suspicion of informant leaks within Russian engineering units. Artillery support was criticized as inadequate for suppressing Ukrainian positions before column advances. The absence of effective counter-battery fire against Ukrainian artillery and rocket systems pre-registered on the kill zones was noted in multiple fragments as a critical failure. Russian forces operating in this sector were not blind to what was happening. They simply could not find an effective response within the operational timeline they were given. Battle damage assessment from satellite imagery analyzed by commercial providers and open-source researchers confirmed the persistence of wreckage along the southeastern approaches. Maxar and Planet imagery from this period, cross-referenced against geolocated footage, showed burned-out hulks remaining in place for extended periods, an indicator that Russian forces were unable to conduct battlefield recovery operations in the contact zone, meaning they were consistently operating under Ukrainian fire observation and could not secure even a temporary pause sufficient to extract damaged equipment. Vehicles that cannot be recovered cannot be repaired. The attrition, in other words, was permanent. The strategic ripple effects of the 47th's defensive success in this sector extended beyond the immediate frontage. Russian forces pressing toward Pokrovsk from the southeast found their armored strength progressively degraded without corresponding Ukrainian positional losses sufficient to justify the cost. The rail junction at Pokrovsk remained in Ukrainian hands. The logistics arteries it supported continued to function. The Russian operational timetable for any advance toward Pokrovsk, already stressed by the difficulties of the broader Donetsk offensive, was set back by the equipment losses and the inability to find a tactical solution to the channelized killzone problem. Elsewhere on the Donetsk front, the pattern of mined approach corridors with deliberate lanes leading to prepared kill zones was not unique to the 47th sector, but the southeastern Pokrovsk approaches became one of the more thoroughly documented examples of the technique because of the volume of wreckage footage that emerged and the relative clarity of the terrain for satellite observation. Ukrainian doctrine in this regard had evolved significantly from the early phases of the full-scale war, when minefields were often laid as dense barriers without the sophisticated shaping architecture that the 47th employed. The lessons absorbed from 18 months of intensive defensive fighting had produced a more refined and operationally sophisticated approach. What do you think? Was the failure here primarily a Russian tactical problem, or does it point to something deeper in how Russian combined arms doctrine handles prepared defensive depth? Drop your answer in the comments. We read everyone. The doctrine implications of what happened southeast of Pokrovsk extend well beyond Ukraine's specific situation. NATO, planning for the defense of the Baltic states and Eastern European members, has incorporated mobility denial concepts for decades, but the application demonstrated in this sector offers concrete operational data on how channelized kill zone architecture performs against a modern armored opponent operating with UAV reconnaissance and engineering support. The 47th's experience points to several practical conclusions. First, the deliberate lane technique is most effective when the defender can maintain surveillance of the lane and reseal it with remote mining faster than the attacker can commit a new formation. This requires integration between mine-laying assets, UAV observation, and fire control that is easier to describe than to achieve under combat conditions. But the 47th demonstrated that it was achievable at brigade level with the systems available to the Ukrainian military in this period. Second, the pre-registration of fire on kill zone exits, rather than the minefield itself, is the element that turns mobility denial from a delay into a loss generation mechanism. Mines stop vehicles. Pre-registered fires destroy them. The combination achieves attrition rather than merely deceleration, which is the distinction that makes the operational cost to the attacker prohibitive. Third, and perhaps most important for any force considering how to defend against armored assault with limited resources, the 47th's approach was fundamentally about the attacker's decision-making. The engineering was not designed to stop Russian tanks directly. It was designed to make Russian commanders choose specific routes, at specific times, in specific formations. Once the attacker is choosing what the defender needs him to choose, the physical engagement is already largely decided. The historical resonance of this doctrine is worth acknowledging. Similar principles, shape the battlefield so the enemy attacks where you are strongest, appear in any competent defensive operation in the modern era. The German elastic defense in depth on the Western Front in 1917 and 1918 used comparable logic, as did the Soviet deep battle defensive preparations before Kursk in 1943. The specific mechanisms differ enormously across those eras. The conceptual spine is consistent. Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade in the autumn and winter of 2024 was working from the same doctrinal foundation, implemented with 21st century tools. Does that mean history is simply repeating itself? Or does the combination of FPV drones, remote mining, and commercial satellite observation represent a genuinely new chapter in how prepared defense defeats armored assault? That is the question that should be driving conversations in every military academy studying this war. There is a detail from the wreckage footage that stuck with me and that I think captures the operational situation better than any strategic overview can. In one geolocated sequence, a T-72B3 sits burned out roughly 40 meters past the visible edge of what had been the minefield belt. 40 meters. The crew navigated the entire prepared obstacle, reached apparently clear ground, and died within seconds of doing so because the kill zone did not begin at the minefield. It began after it. The minefield was not the danger. The minefield was the funnel. The Ukrainian fire waiting at the other end was the danger, and it was there because engineers and planners had decided, weeks in advance, that this exact piece of ground was where Russian armor would arrive. Will you see a drone team or an FPV strike in this comment section? Almost certainly. Comment reseal if you want us to go deeper on the remote mining systems, the specific munition types, their delivery platforms, and how Ukrainian engineers coordinated resupply under contact in a dedicated follow-up episode. The 47th Mechanized Brigade's defense of the mined approaches southeast of Pokrovsk is one of the cleaner examples in this war of a defending force using conceptual superiority to overcome numerical disadvantage. It did not happen because Ukraine had weapons Russia lacked. It happened because Ukrainian planners understood Russian behavior better than Russian commanders understood Ukrainian preparation. The trap worked because it was built for the enemy that was actually coming, rather than an idealized adversary who would have recognized the shaping and adapted before committing. 3 questions that deserve serious consideration as this sector continues to evolve. Could Russia have prevented this if it had committed more engineering assets to systematic lane clearance before armored assault, rather than relying on reconnaissance sweeps that the Ukrainians anticipated and incorporated into their resealed timing? The answer, based on what we know of Russian engineering capacity and its integration with assault formations in this period, is probably yes, but only if that commitment had been made before the first catastrophic loss event rather than after. Institutional momentum in Russian combined arms operations runs strongly in favor of the assault schedule over the engineering preparation. How does the 47th's experience change NATO doctrine for defending terrain against mechanized assault? The specific answer varies by terrain, force composition, and available munitions. The general answer is that the integration of remote mining with pre-registered fires and UAV-directed anti-armor engagement has been validated at brigade scale under combat conditions, which is a different level of doctrinal proof than any exercise can provide. And looking ahead, where does this leave the Pokrovsk axis? Russian forces have shown the capacity to absorb these losses and continue pressing. The question is whether the attrition in this sector, combined with the operational pressure elsewhere along the Donetsk front, degrades Russian assault capacity to the point where the advance stalls at something close to the current line, or whether the weight of Russian numbers eventually forces a Ukrainian adjustment. The mine belt is not infinite. The reseal capacity depends on munition supply. The kill zone stays effective only as long as Ukrainian fire assets can maintain their pre-registered positions. Every element of the 47th's defensive architecture depends on the continuity of Western military support that provides the munitions, the surveillance technology, and the air defense umbrella that keeps Ukrainian positions survivable. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one. If this kind of operational-level analysis is what you come here for, the reconstruction of actual battlefield doctrine from open-source evidence, without the noise and the headline chasing, subscribe to Frontline Truth UA. We publish this kind of OSINT investigation every week, working through the footage, the terrain, the unit histories, and the doctrinal implications to give you the picture that the daily coverage misses. The next episode is already in reconstruction. You will want to be here for it.